Okay, so now we want to add the ability to create new episodes. So to begin, we are going to do a Rails generate controller, and we're going to generate a episodes controller. So hit enter. Then let's go to Sublime and go under controllers, episodes controller. Now before we do anything here, we need to make some routes for our episodes. But these are going to be nested under the podcast because if you think about it, a episode does not belong on its own. An episode only belongs under a podcast. So what we'll do is we will change this resources podcast to a block by doing do end. Then inside of here, we'll create resources for the episodes and save that. Now we can do rake routes. And you can see all of the episode routes were created right here. But instead of just being the regular slash episode, it's now slash podcast episodes, etc. So I want to first create the ability to create a new episode. So to do that, inside of our episodes controller, we need to define a def new and a def create method. So def new is going to have episode equals podcast.episodes.new. So in order to be able to do @podcast, we need to first find the podcast. But we want to do that in a private method. So down here, I'm going to define a def find podcast, as well as a def find find episode. Inside the def find podcast, we'll do @podcast equals podcast.find, and we're going to find by the params of the podcast underscore ID. And then the episode will find @episode equals episode.find by params of ID. And then what we want to do is up top, we'll do a before action to find podcast. And then we'll do another before action to find the episode. But the find episode, we only want on the show method, which we haven't created yet, but we'll just add it as is for now. @episode equals @podcast, so it's finding the podcast by the podcast params, and then it's creating a new episode. Then in the def create, we're going to do the same @episodes episode equals @podcast.episodes.new, except we're going to throw in some episode underscore params, and we need to define what those episode params are. So under the private method, let's do def episode params, and then we need to we need to require the params for the episode, and then we're going to permit the title and the description. So now in our create method, if the episode is able to save, if @episode.save, we're going to redirect to podcast episode path, and then we are going to define or add in the @podcast. So what this is doing is it's going to the podcast path, and then it's finding the podcast ID. Else we are going to render new end. All right, so let's save that. So if I go to /rocketship podcast /episodes/new, uninitialized constant episodes controller, podcast. Oh, I misspelled. Where is this? Def find podcast. Okay. There we go. Refresh. All right, now we get a template is missing error, just as we should. So it's looking for the new.html.erb. So let's go ahead and create that. Under the app views episodes, let's create a new file and save this as new.html.erb. So I'm just going to write an H1 and say new episode. And then let's create the form. So form_for. And since this is a nested form, it's going to be a bit different. We're going to find the podcast and then the episode. So this is a form for the podcast and then episode, and then do, and we'll do F, and then go down to the bottom and end that. So let's just add the title and the description. Let's do f.label for the title, and let's add a BR tag to break it to the next line. Let's do the same f.text field for the title. And then let's just add a BR tag to break this up. We'll clean this up later, of course. f.label for the description. f.text area for the description. BR tag, and then let's just do f.submit. So now if I go back and refresh, you can see new episode. We have the option to create a new title and a description. So let's try out, see if we can create a new episode. So I'm just going to call this episode number 1. And let's go to hipsum.co and grab some filler text for the description. Paste that in, create episode. All right, so we get a no routes match podcast episode path. Oh, I think I know what happened. So let's go to the episodes controller. Let's check the rake routes. So no routes match action show controller podcast ID. Okay, so we're trying to grab the podcast ID right here for the app podcast, but it's grabbing everything. So let's try just adding .id. Actually, it might be smart enough to just do it on its own. Let's try going to the episode path. Let's go back and create episode again. Okay, so we do in fact need that because we are missing required keys of ID. So let's try @podcast.id and create the episode. Okay, I know what's happening. So this should be @podcast @episode. Let's go back and create an episode. There we go. So we accidentally created 4 episodes, but that's totally fine. We can delete those. So the issue was it needed to find the podcast ID. So we did that through @podcast, and then it needed the episode ID because it's a nested route. So we needed to define both. So now we are on the show page, but we have an unknown action. So let's create that. Go under the create method, do a def show and end, refresh. Now we have a template is missing. So let's create that template, episodes, save a new file in the app views episodes. And I will save this as show.html.erb. Now what I'm going to do is go to the podcast show. It's going to be almost the same as this page. And I'm just going to paste it in, save that. Let's go back and refresh. So all the podcast information is, we're able to get that because we're doing the before action find podcast. So it's finding the podcast. That's how we're able to access the podcast title, description, link, etc. So what we want to do is change this static content to loop through our episodes. So to do that, so what we want to do is add the episode content. So I'm going to go to the static page and go to episode.html. Then I'm going to grab the episode content div, and let's place that under the breadcrumbs and make sure it's tabbed in. There we go. Now let's change the title to @episode.title, Ruby @episode.title. Go back and refresh. All right, now we have episode number 1, and let's get the title, which will probably be the same, or the description, @episode.description, which it is. All right, so that's looking good. So next, let's change the breadcrumbs. So let's add another span and also episode.title. So let's go back and refresh. Now we have the episode title. We need to change this and add a link to, and we're going to say @podcast.title. Oops. Then we're going to go to the podcast path @podcast. And then the span, and then the episode title. Refresh. Now we should be able to click here. Now go to all podcasts. Perfect. All right, so now that we have episodes, we should be able to loop through them on the show page. So let me go to the podcast show. So what I'm going to do is just under the UL, I'm going to do @episodes.each, do episode, and then I have the LI content, tab that in. Let's just stub out the link for now. We'll just keep this as is until we get the paperclip image uploading. Then we want to have the title tweaked a bit. So let's remove this. Let's do a link to episode.title, and we'll go to the podcast episode path, and then we'll do @podcast, episode. So let's save that, refresh. Oh, okay, so we need to just do the end. We're missing the end block from the episodes each do. We'll probably still get an error. Yeah, so we get a undefined method .each. So if we go to our episodes controller, or I'm sorry, our podcast controller, what we need to do is find the episode as well. So @episode equals episode.where the podcast_ID is equal to @podcast. And then we want to order created _@ in descending order. So save that, refresh. Oops, @episodes. Be sure to make sure that's plural because in the show we have episodes. Refresh. There we go. So since we created episode number 1 4 times, they're all the same. Let's go ahead and delete the static content. Save that, refresh. Let's test it out by doing podcast/1 episodes/new. This works. And I'll do hipsum.co again, grab some filler text, just a little bit this time, and paste that in. So now we're on, we get redirected to episode 5. And let's go back to the Rocket Ship podcast. You can see this does work. So it's now looping through all of the podcast episodes. Beautiful. And if we click on the link, it takes us to that. Let's change this loop to be not static as well. So let's go back to, see, this is pretty messy. I'm just going to close out of these. Let's go to the episodes controller. So for the def show, we're going to do @episode equals episodes or episode.where the podcast ID is equal to @podcast. So basically this is going to find all the podcast episodes that belong to this podcast. And then let's do order created _ descending. Save that. Now in the episode show page, we are basically going to do the same thing right under the UL. We'll do a loop episodes.each do episode. And then let's close that loop. And then we will push over this content and let's do a link to. I'm just going to copy this from the show page. Oh, you know what? We forgot to change this to the dynamic content. What we are going to do for the description, this is on the podcast show page. Let's do truncate method episode.description. So what this is doing is it's grabbing the episode description and it's doing the truncate method. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. At a length of, let's do 150 characters. And then close that. So I'm going to go back to the show page. So you can see it limits the amount of characters for each. If I did change this to 50, for example, and refreshed, you can see it limits to only 50 characters, then it does the ... So let's do maybe 160. That looks good. Now on this page, let's do the same. So I'm going to copy these two and change them here. Whoops. Refresh. Perfect. So let's go ahead and delete everything that is static down to the UL. Save that. Let's move the end over. There we go. And one last thing I want to do is, let's say we're on the episode 5, This Works. You can see that that episode still shows up right here. What I want to do is make it so in this loop, we reject it if it's the current episode. So we can do that by going to our episodes controller and adding a .reject method. And we'll do e.id equals @episode.id. Save that. Now let's go back and refresh. Now you can see the This Works does not show up in the loop. And that's because it's rejecting it if the ID, basically this is looping through all of the loop. And then if the ID equals the episode ID, so the current episode, it rejects it from that loop. All right, so let's do a git status. Let's do a git add dot git s git commit with the message add episode controller and views. Okay, so now in the next video we are going to add the dashboard, and then we are going to add the ability to edit and destroy an episode.